Hello, everyone, and welcome back to video number 2 in the series that I've posted to the Course Spaces LMS for horror video games 311F from the AHVS department. For lecture number 10. We left off the last video with the instruction to switch to slide number 4 in the PowerPoint presentation. And so, without reason to do otherwise, I will simply pick up there and proceed straight on. So, cumulatively, in terms of the conversations and theory we've looked at in class so far, from the perspective of the argument in favor of game activity, the active nature of ludology, the argument that suggests that activity itself creates some sort of a physiological connection and is the stronger in the creation of horror in general. Such should be, from that perspective, that the identificatory gender slide encouraged by the slasher film, as Clover describes it, should actually be amplified by a player's ability to actively embody avatars in video games. And thus, from Clover's perspective, should thus be even more progressive in terms of inviting male viewers to expand their otherwise homophobic gender identities. Now, this really informs what Weiss was on about with his description of the procedural adaptation of the Clock Tower games. According to Weiss, the player's agency in the Clock Tower games is entirely contained within Jennifer's psychological limits as a final girl. That is to say, as a point-and-click adventure, there's not much for the player actually to actively do other than embody her terror. He says that angry displays of force may belong to the male killer, but crying, cowering, screaming, fainting, trembling, begging for mercy belong to the female final girl. He's, of course, paraphrasing Carol Clover herself with that assertion. And according to Weiss, a Clock Tower puts the player into the world of these gendered actions. Things that might not scare a macho warrior will scare Jennifer. And this is something the player must deal with, whether they like it or not. As a macho warrior is a reference to the typical male hero in many action or FPS video games, to which Jennifer, the character of Jennifer, plays decidedly is a counterpoint. And so whether they want to or not, they're put into this position of embodying her fear as the final girl. The player must learn to manage Jennifer's fear, to work within her mental faculties in order to survive. Now, in Clock Tower 2, Jennifer is, in fact, as Weiss points out, not the only playable character. So the first one, Jennifer's the only playable character. The protagonist, Jennifer, is the only playable character. But in Clock Tower 2, from the Japanese series, which he is trading on, there are other character choices available. The player is given a choice near the beginning of the game of whether they wish to play as Jennifer or as Helen. In other words, according to Weiss, they are given the choice of who will be the final girl. Now, this is significant, according to Weiss, because Helen fits the archetype of Clovel's final girl actually more closely than Jennifer does. This is a quote: "The final girl is boyish, in a word. Just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine. Not, in any case, as feminine in the way of her friends. Her smartness, gravity, and competence in mechanical and other practical matters, and sexual reluctance, set her apart from other girls." Now, what Weiss points out is that Jennifer is actually very feminine by the traditional conventions of Hollywood femininity. Helen, by contrast, is much more androgynous than Jennifer. Nevertheless, he points out, even though Helen might be more typically like the final girl in her androgyny, he points out that the core gameplay mechanics of exploration, fear management, and fleeing or outsmarting Scissorman are still present from Clock Tower, and of course they're the same for both Jennifer and Helen. But the point he makes is that this allows the player actually to decide what kind of final girl they want to be, in contradistinction to cinema, in which the final girl is predetermined. And if the killer is masculine to feminine, if the killer moves from masculine to feminine, in contrast to the final girl who moves from feminine to masculine, then games like, for example, Dead by Daylight, in which the player can play as either the killer or the survivor, should even further amplify the encouragement of the gender slide that Clover delineates. So ultimately, Weiss concludes that the core transmedial pleasure, and I mentioned this last class, his conclusion is powerful. The core transmedial pleasure in these games lies in the player getting to step into the final girl's role and discover the emergent dynamics of her iconic peril for themselves. They get to finally discover what it's like to be the person they've mocked by shouting "Don't go in there" so many times. He's actually dramatizing. He's staging the behavior of the often excited, the parasocial behavior of the typically male viewer of the horror film, or even any gender viewer of the horror film, when we've so many times said, "I would just leave" or "Don't go in there." In the process, he says that stepping into the shoes of the final girl, the player may discover that surviving an unstoppable, psychically superior killing machine, physically superior killing machine with nothing but a cotton dress and their wits, he says, isn't as easy as it always looked from the safety of the darkened theater. A humorous, if not poignant, conclusion. And according to Weiss, it's this sense of discovery that what he calls, if you remember, procedural adaptations offer the player of how ourselves personally, not someone else, not some character with whom we're identifying, but how we, in the first person, not avatar, but the first person specific, might act when confronted by horrific circumstances. This is a little bit, I think, idealistic in that there is still the protection of the screen. Again, he is, I think, trading quite extensively on the powerful identificatory nature of the joystick, I call it, simply being connected physiologically through presence and flow, as Pinchbeck called them, doesn't necessarily translate to heightened identification, but it is this sense of discovery, he argues, this very much stepping into the decision-making processes of the final girl that allows us to enjoy the horrific circumstances more poignantly. Now, in the process, the player, he says, might discover they're more like the horror film protagonist than they are, or less. And it's this sense of discovery that procedural adaptation offers the player of how ourselves personally, again, not someone else, might act when confronted. But in the end, we're fundamentally, as you may have heard hinted in my tone of voice up to this point, left with the same old argument as to, is it passive reception, as described by someone like Christian Metz, or active participation in terms of ludological theory that heightens the experience of horror? Does the ability to embody avatars heighten progressive gender identifications, or does the act of ludology evacuate the necessary passive reception of such gender slides available in cinema, as Clover describes them? And at this point, I'll invite you now to switch to slide number 5 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture. And from slide 4, this question, does the ability to embody the avatar heighten progressive identifications? Again, this active versus passive argument. This question actually leads nicely into the 2 readings assigned for today. Assigned for last week, both of which were penned actually by game designers, you may have noticed, rather than game theorists, for what you might have considered a refreshing change. And taken back to back, these two articles actually subtly betray either side of the debate. The first of these was Richard Rouse III's Match Made in Hell. And in it, he actually doesn't provide much that is new regarding the active ludology versus passive cinema reception debate that we've been exploring throughout the course. He does, of course, make an interesting addendum to the group that presented on Doom when he surveys the evolution of the Doom game series. And just as that group argued that Doom became decidedly horror with Doom 2016, Rouse actually argues that it was with Doom 3 from 2005 that the technology had come much farther and was capable of rendering highly detailed characters without complex lighting. The drawback was that it wasn't capable of showing that many of them, and the advanced lighting was expensive enough that it forced more limited play spaces. Hence, as he says, and here's the significant phrase, the game took a significantly more horror direction, with fewer, tougher enemies leaping out of nearby shadows instead of the giant battlefields packed with zillions of creatures. Now, from the active ludology side of the debate, of course, Rouse III makes some really unqualified assertions, unfortunately. He says, in any non-interactive media, the audience is seeing unfortunate events or life-threatening occurrences happen for another person. And the audience's own tension is only possible through empathy with that character's plight. He goes on to say, with the player fully immersing himself in the game world, fear becomes much more intense. And he claims that players project themselves into the main character much more than in any other medium. He concludes this is especially true in first-person games. But really? Is this really true? He provides no significant theory or anecdote to support this assertion. And indeed, as Clover had more critically observed in her article, mentioned in the previous video lecture, the relation between camera point of view and the processes of viewer identification are actually poorly understood. The strongest defense, however, provided by Rouse III, reside in two examples that he gives. The first of these, he says, the most extreme example of player transportation is a near-miss projectile in a first-person shooter, which may actually cause someone to shift to one side in their seat while they play. I think a more powerful example of this is players that are new to a game like, let's say, Mario Kart. And they're just becoming familiar with the presence and flow of the joystick. When they're trying to get, for example, the motion detector joystick to move the character in one direction more than they're able to do with the mechanics of gameplay, they shift as they think that there's some sort of an unconscious belief that shifting from side to side will actually have an effect on the character. They're not thinking that through cognitively. That's, of course, largely physiological. Which is actually not what he's talking about. His says that the transportation is when the vision on the screen comes at you so rapidly, that you are, if a missile is coming towards you, you'll shift out of the way when your presence and flow or your transportation is such that you're caught in the game. However, this is often true for horror cinema as well, or even cinema in general. The very narratives that are included in many history of film studies courses almost universally include the story of the Lumiere brothers' late 19th century cinema verite called The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat. And these naive, unfamiliar with cinema, these audiences, as the train rumbled towards them on the screen, even though, as you can see from this image, it was clearly going sort of to the left off screen, many of them, as the story goes, jumped from their seats to avoid being hit by the image of the oncoming train. It's been questioned as to the veracity of this story because cinema history tends to like to dramatize and even melodramatize things a little, and it's questionable whether audiences, as naive as they might have been with new cinema, were so fooled that the screen was going to burst into their own reality. Nevertheless, the point is that this extreme transportation that Roast the Third assigns to the video game might just as easily be assigned to cinema in general. What's interesting is that that doesn't evacuate his argument, it just doesn't exclude cinema from the debate. Now, the second example that he gives in defense of this, obviously, he privileges the active ludology side of the debate. It certainly is in much stronger relation to what we've referred to, or what Pinchbeck referred to from theory as flow and presence, related to transportation, or in terms of the very active gameplay, what we refer to as automaticity. So when you're not thinking about the joystick anymore, you're just comfortable with the buttons enough to see the effects of your gameplay on the screen. And he says that almost all narrative video games are power fantasies of one kind or another. If too much of the player's feeling of power is taken away in comparison to what they're accustomed to experiencing in other games, they're going to feel frustrated and hence pulled out of the experience. And in this context, he's very critical of the cutscene. And the cutscene is surely one of the most jarring immersion breakers in a game's toolbox, he says. Though a cutscene can perfectly recreate a horror moment from a movie, since it is a movie, it tends to pull players out of the experience, he says. Now, he goes on to give the example of how Resident Evil 4 introduced the notion of keeping the player immersed in the cutscenes by adding actually limited interaction to them. At key moments, players would need to hit a button to make their character swing a knife at just the right instant to stop a potentially fatal attack. And though this is minimal interaction, he says it keeps players on edge. But it really did nothing, according to him, to make them feel truly empowered, creating a Space Ace-esque experience which had the potential to be frustrating in its own right. And at this point in the lecture, I was actually going to ask if anybody had played either Space Ace or its kin, Dragon's Lair, from the late 80s and early 90s. But of course, we won't get the chance to do that. And I would encourage you to go online and have a look at a video of either of these games. These were highly animated games by famed animator Don Bluth, who was really involved with a lot of adult-level animation sequences in the late 80s and early 1990s. And really, in these games, all you're allowed to do is, as the animation plays out, one side of the screen or front of the screen will flash, and at the exact right time, you have to move the joystick in that direction in order to proceed through the game or die. And the point here is that these games, these early games like Space Ace and Dragon's Lair, really did not involve the player on any sort of level of presence or flow. It was just an animated experience, and his argument is that the very limited empowerment that is afforded the player during the cutscenes in Resident Evil 4 were similar to those, and may questionably have worked to keep the player from being ejected from their interactivity with the game through the phenomenon of the cutscene. But now on the other side of the debate, in terms of our two game designer readings, lies also some indirect assertions. They're not as direct as the ones made by Rouse III, made by Thomas Grip in the Game Design Deep Dive about the Amnesia Sanity Meter article. Although he was surely not out to defend this argument in any way, the passive cinema argument was obviously not his intention. However, at one point in his article, he observes around the time we were questioning the design of the sanity system, it started to become more and more clear to me that not everything in a game has to be competitive in nature. And he says, sometimes making something gamey just destroys the horror feeling that you're after. And this is a pretty clear, if not indirect, defense, actually, of the passive cinema side of the argument in terms of what is necessary for a viewer or player to experience horror per se. Referring specifically to the act of ludology, he rephrases, again, that sometimes focusing too much on fun can destroy certain horror aspects of a game. And less clearly, but still seemingly on the passive reception side of the argument, he concludes that when you no longer have a strict and simplistic gaming system driving it all, the player's imagination is free to roam, and the horror experience, according to him, can become much more powerful. Alas, it seems it remains up to us in our construction of this fledgling discourse to resolve this debate or to undermine the question itself by observing its fundamentally subjective nature and perhaps therefore its unresolvability in terms of discovering for any given individual whether passive reception in the cinema experience or active ludology in the gaming experience are the more powerful agent in the creation of the experience of what Noel Carroll calls art horror. And again, I'm going to cut the video here. There is a third section to this lecture video. Will give me the opportunity to talk a little bit about VR. And so I'll encourage you now to flip to slide number 6 in this PowerPoint presentation and set yourself up for the third installment of the video series for Lecture 10.